Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be taking a look at the first major trial to be broadcast to the general public on US television. The case centres around a man named Jens Soering, the son of a German diplomat who was born in Thailand in 1966. He moved to Atlanta in the United States in 1977. Whilst in high school, he was an editor on the school newspaper, a photographer, acted in school plays, played guitar in a band, and also won awards for his artwork. This was all part of his plan to be accepted into a German university, but he actually secured a place into the University of Virginia, where he received a full scholarship as well as extra spending money, so he decided to take up this offer instead. Despite these extensive accomplishments and activities, he remained insecure and quite socially awkward. While he was attending the University of Virginia, he met a woman by the name of Elizabeth Haysom. Born in April 1964, Elizabeth was a Canadian citizen who was 2 years older than Jens. Elizabeth had been educated in boarding schools in Switzerland and also England. Her parents were keen for her to follow in her father's footsteps and pursue a career in engineering, and she was enrolled into high-level science and mathematics classes. However, her passion and talent lay in the more artistic subjects, and as such her grades began to suffer. Around this time, it is believed that she began experimenting with drugs, and when she was not accepted into her preferred choice of Trinity College at Cambridge University, she ran away from home to travel around Europe with her girlfriend. After being away for around 4 months, bouncing from one place and job to the next, Elizabeth returned to live with her parents. Her father was offered a job in Virginia, and her parents decided it would be best for the family to relocate to the United States, and for Elizabeth to hopefully settle down and resume her education at the University of Virginia. It was at the orientation day at the university that Elizabeth and Jens met for the first time. However, the two lived in separate worlds and did not have many friends or activities in common. The pair met again during a movie screening in October, and by November they were regularly meeting up in and around campus. Elizabeth viewed Jens as a tortured artist and later admitted that she would try to fight her feelings towards him, but nevertheless their relationship continued and became intense very quickly. In December 1984, she left a letter in his dorm room that read, "I hated my love for you for a long time. I hated myself for discovering vulnerability. But as the weeks passed by, I began to understand. I had always believed that I made men fall in love with me, and I would make a man humiliate himself to obtain me. Then I'd give him the best he's ever likely to get, and then walk out." She went on to describe how it was different with Jens, stating, "I love you. It may alter intensity and direction from time to time, but I will always love you with a part of me that no one else will be able to snatch." The two spent the majority of their time together until the winter break forced them apart, each returning home to their respective families. Jens' father had always been strict, but with age had increasingly developed a temper, while Jens' mother had become dependent on alcohol and was prone to mood swings and bouts of depression. Elizabeth also had a very difficult home life. Her father was described as an authoritarian who was reserved and withdrawn, and Elizabeth had an extremely difficult relationship with her mother. In later years, there were allegations that Elizabeth's mother had sexually abused her after investigators found naked pictures of Elizabeth that her mother had taken. Elizabeth denied any abuse, and it was stated that her mother had only used these images as references for her artwork. Irrespective, these pictures were certainly alarming. Jens and Elizabeth found solace in each other through letters during this winter break. In one, Elizabeth wrote that she'd had a day of reigning loneliness. She said her father fell down and she prayed, but he had got back up. She wrote that she prayed her mother would use the poker on her cold, guiding father. Jens wrote back and said that he was ever to meet her parents, he would have the ultimate weapon. He said strange things were happening inside him, and he was becoming more and more like a Christ figure. He said he would either make them completely lose their wits, have heart attacks, or become lovers of the rest of the world. When Jens did eventually meet Elizabeth's parents, 72-year-old Derek and 53-year-old Nancy, unsurprisingly, the meeting did not go well. Derek and Nancy instantly disliked Jens and did not think that he was good enough for their daughter. The relationship between the two couples became very strained. Elizabeth's parents believed that Jens was arrogant and cynical and fueled what they saw as Elizabeth's dramatic nature. In a letter, Elizabeth wrote to Jens stating that she hoped it was possible to hypnotize her parents, to do voodoo on them and will them to death. She went on to state that she was excited that it would seem that some of her prayers had started to work. Her parents had experienced several accidents during a skiing trip that year. Her father nearly drove off a cliff, and at another time was almost squashed by a falling tree. Her mother had been so drunk that she'd fallen over into a fireplace. Elizabeth was starting to believe that she should take up black magic because she clearly had a gift for willing things into existence. On Friday the 29th of March 1985, Jens and Elizabeth rented a grey Chevette and they headed from Virginia to Washington, D.C. They rented a room in the Georgetown Marriott, paid for with Jens' father's credit card, and they booked tickets to see several films and enjoyed a pleasant weekend together before returning back to the university on Sunday the 31st of March. On Wednesday the 3rd of April 1985, Elizabeth was located and informed that her parents had been murdered. They had been brutally stabbed to death in their own home 4 days earlier. There was no sign of forced entry and no murder weapon was found. Several footprints were discovered in Derek and Nancy's blood, one that had been made by a tennis shoe, and there were 2 more by someone only wearing a sock. An FBI profiler said that they suspected the murderer to be a woman, and suspicions fell on the daughter of a local judge who had previously been engaged to one of Elizabeth's half-brothers. The engagement had been called off and the girl had been greatly upset by it, but before long investigators were able to rule her out of their inquiries. Soon, suspicion about Jens and Elizabeth's involvement in the murders began to increase when investigators discovered that the car they had hired had been driven almost 700 miles during their weekend away. This was about 400 miles more than the trip to and from Washington, D.C. The mileage would however be around the exact amount to travel from Charlottesville, Virginia to Washington, Washington to Elizabeth's parents, and back along the same route. The couple were asked to provide blood, fingerprint and footprint samples in order to rule them out as suspects, but instead they disappeared. They actually made it out of the country, taking an extremely complex route through Europe and Asia, before finally ending up in England, living in London under assumed names. They had always had their parents' money to rely upon and were now struggling to get by. They came up with a scheme to take advantage of the cheque guarantee system in the UK at the time. They began buying items just under the cheque limit of £50 and then they returned them for a cash refund. They were eventually caught doing this in a Marks and Spencer's store in Richmond, London, over a year after the murders. Their apartment was searched and numerous items, including letters between the pair, were found, which led the authorities in London to contact those investigating Elizabeth's parents' murders. During questioning, Jens confessed. He provided details of the night of the killings, stating that Elizabeth had remained in Washington by herself in order to establish an alibi, whilst Jens had gone to visit her parents at their house. He said that Elizabeth's father had opened the door and let him in, and then offered him a drink. But during their conversation, Derek and Nancy stated that they would get Jens expelled from the University of Virginia if he didn't break up with their daughter. Jens refused, and when he got up to leave, Elizabeth's father slammed his head into a wall A dazed and confused Jens then grabbed a knife and lashed out at Derek. A struggle followed, during which time both Derek and Nancy were stabbed dozens of times and both their throats were slashed. Jens claimed that the next thing he remembered was throwing tableware and his clothes into a rubbish bin that was further down the street and getting back into the car wearing only a sheet. He then drove back to meet up with Elizabeth and the two returned to their hotel room. However, Jens later changed his confession. He stated that he had only confessed before because he believed that he would have immunity from prosecution in the US due to his father being a diplomat. He believed that he would be tried as a minor in Germany and as such receive a maximum sentence of 10 years with the potential to be out in just 5. He then claimed that it was actually Elizabeth who'd been the one to go to her parents' house that night. He said that she'd been using drugs again and owed her dealer a lot of money. She was supposed to pay off her debt by picking up some drugs from Washington and bringing them back to the University of Virginia. Her dealer told her that if she didn't go through with this, he would tell her parents that she had started using drugs again. Jens stated that Elizabeth had returned to the hotel room that evening covered in blood and pleaded with him to allow her to use his cinema ticket as an alibi. He agreed, believing that it would protect her from being given the death penalty. However, in 1987, Elizabeth stated that it was Jens who had committed the murder and she pleaded guilty to accessory to murder before the fact, going on to testify against Jens in court. Elizabeth received 45 years for each accessory charge, which would be served consecutively. Jens stuck to his second confession and fought the charges which were brought against him. The case against him was predominantly based on his confession and an overlay of his socked footprint compared to the footprint recovered at the scene of the murders. These appeared to show an exact size match. However, it was argued that similar to gloved handprints, the lack of any dermal ridges would make these socked prints far from unique. The origin of the tennis shoe print was never explained at trial. In 1990, he was found guilty of both murders. He avoided the death penalty as the UK had refused to extradite him to the US unless it was guaranteed that he would not be sentenced to death if found guilty. He received 2 consecutive life sentences. In the years that followed, Jens filed a number of legal appeals, all of which were unsuccessful. Elizabeth maintains that it was Jens who is guilty of the murders, whilst he continues to blame her. Requests for a pardon and many attempts for parole were unsuccessful until 2019, when both he and Elizabeth were released without pardons and then handed over to immigration for extradition to their home countries of Germany and Canada. They both served over 30 years for their crimes. There have subsequently been various different books written about this horrific murder, including some of them written by Jens. I would just like to say thank you to Kayla Dan for suggesting that I cover the case, hi to Dub for commenting on this comment, and also to Anthony Stike from Virginia for kindly sending in copies of the death certificates for Elizabeth's parents, Derek and Nancy. Thanks for that, Anthony. And thank you for listening to the case. I hope you found today's story interesting. Please like, comment, and if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. If you would like to help the channel financially, I do have Buy Me a Coffee and also Super Thanks. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. If you have already commented, where is the intro music? Then please leave your comment up. I appreciate that you're so observant. Here it is if you've missed it. Goodbye.